Most people believe silence is what remains when everything meaningful has gone. But what if it's actually where everything meaningful begins to return? There comes a quiet moment, often after exhaustion, disappointment, or one too many restless nights, when the noise stops working the way it used to. You may still fill your days, answer messages, play something in the background, yet a gentle emptiness lingers. Not painful exactly, just persistent. It's the feeling of standing in a crowded place and realizing you've misplaced something you can't name. And strangely, the more you try to outrun it, the more patiently it waits. This story begins in that tender space many people secretly recognize but rarely admit. It's for the ones who are tired of reacting, tired of carrying invisible weight, tired of pretending they don't need a pause. Because beneath all the noise, there is a quieter self that never learned how to shout, only how to wait. What if the clarity you've been searching for isn't found by adding more, but by allowing something to fall away? And what if, just beyond the discomfort of silence, there's a version of you that already knows the way back? He had grown so used to noise that silence felt like a stranger standing in his doorway. When the television wasn't talking, his phone would hum, and when the phone slept, he'd tap the table just to hear something answer back. Quiet made his chest tighten, as if the room were slowly expanding and he might drift inside it. So he filled every pause the way some people keep lights on at night, just in case shadows tried to speak. Still, there were moments when the noise thinned, and he sensed something waiting underneath. On the bus, he scrolled without reading, thumb moving like a metronome for a song he couldn't hear. A child nearby laughed, then fell quiet, and the sudden hush made him glance up as though caught doing something fragile. He wondered, not for the first time, why stillness felt more exposing than a crowd. It wasn't boredom he feared, not really. It was the possibility that a thought might rise with nowhere to hide. So he leaned back into the digital chatter, letting it wash over him like safe, shallow water. At night, he kept a small radio by his bed, tuned between stations where the static never settled. The soft hiss filled the corners of the room, a fuzzy blanket against the kind of quiet that asks questions. He told himself it helped him sleep, though his eyes often stayed open, tracing the ceiling's faint cracks. Sometimes he'd turn the dial lower, just a little, testing how much silence he could tolerate. Each time, he raised it again before the quiet grew bold enough to speak his name. Once, during a power outage, the radio died mid-whisper, leaving the apartment bare and echoing. He lit a candle and noticed how loud the flame seemed, how it flickered like a hesitant heartbeat. Without the usual distractions, memories drifted in uninvited. A harsh word, a door closing, a chance he never took. He shifted in his chair, almost laughing at himself, then reached for a notebook he hadn't opened in years. But instead of writing, he just stared at the blank page as if it were staring back. Somewhere deep down, he suspected the silence wasn't empty at all, only patient. It felt less like a void and more like a locked room inside him, one he kept walking past. He wondered, gently, almost reluctantly, if the voice he strained to hear in all that noise had been waiting there all along. The thought unsettled him in a quiet, persistent way, like a soft knock that wouldn't fade. And though he reached again for the radio dial, his hand paused, hovering in the hush. In the days that followed, he began noticing how silence behaved differently from what he had imagined. It didn't rush at him or demand answers. It simply waited, like a patient lake at dawn. When he dared to lower the radio for a few breaths, the quiet felt less like absence and more like space. Space where something gentle might surface if he didn't stir the water too quickly. He wasn't sure why that thought both comforted and unsettled him. One afternoon, he sat by the window while the city carried on below, horns and footsteps fading into a distant murmur. He tried a small experiment, resting his hands on his knees and letting the static remain off for 60 slow seconds. At first, his mind scrambled for something to grab, a memory, a worry, even a grocery list. Then, beneath the usual clutter, there was a faint sense of recognition, like hearing his name in a crowded room. It slipped away the moment he leaned toward it, but the echo lingered. He started to suspect that clarity wasn't something chased down, but something that appeared when pursuit stopped, like muddy water settling when the jar is finally set on the table instead of shaken. All his constant doing, all the background noise, might have been keeping the deeper parts of him blurred. The idea felt almost backward, as if the answer required less effort, not more. He found himself sitting still a little longer each evening, curious despite himself. Sometimes uncomfortable thoughts surfaced, a flash of shame, an old criticism replaying in a familiar voice. His instinct was to drown them out, yet he noticed they softened when he simply let them pass through. He even tried a quiet breath in, slow and careful, as though not to scare the moment away. It was awkward, yes, like learning to stand in a room he'd always rushed through, but there was a strange relief in not having to perform for anyone, not even himself. He didn't have words for it yet, only a growing sense that something truer spoke in whispers. Not a dramatic revelation, just a subtle alignment, like a compass needle settling when the shaking stops. If that quiet voice had always been there, it had been drowned by the static he trusted so much. And as this possibility unfolded, he realized how little he actually knew about the person beneath all that noise. The thought stayed with him, quietly widening, as if inviting him to step closer. He was known among friends as someone who was always busy, always reachable, always in motion. If a message arrived, he answered within seconds, as though silence itself might accuse him of neglect. His calendar looked full enough to impress anyone, yet his evenings felt oddly hollow once the noise faded. He told himself this was normal. People admired productivity, after all, but the word felt heavy in his mouth. When he caught his reflection in dark windows, he sometimes looked away first. Stillness, when it cornered him, brought questions he didn't know how to hold. What do you actually want? Why does none of this feel like enough? The thoughts came softly, but they pressed against him with surprising weight. So he turned the radio back on, adjusted the volume, checked his phone for no particular reason. Anything to avoid standing alone with a voice that sounded suspiciously like his own. Once, after a sharp remark from a coworker, he laughed it off and told a joke, earning the usual smiles. But later, in the elevator's mirrored walls, the words replayed with a sting he couldn't quite shake. He reached for his earbuds before the doors even opened, sealing himself back into safe distraction. It was easier to scroll past the ache than admit how deeply it had landed. He had become skilled at outrunning feelings that had no intention of chasing him. At home, the static-filled radio kept watch like a loyal but exhausting companion. He would sit beside it, shoes still on, letting the hiss fill spaces where thoughts might gather. Part of him feared that if the noise stopped, he'd discover there was nothing underneath, no clear shape, no steady ground. Who would he be without the constant input, the reactions, the roles he slipped into so easily? The uncertainty felt like standing at the edge of a dark lake, unable to see how deep it went. Yet something in him was growing tired of the performance, tired in a quiet, undeniable way. He noticed it in the way his shoulders sank when the day ended, in how long he lingered before turning the dial. There was a longing he couldn't name, gentle but persistent, like homesickness for a place he'd never visited. He didn't understand it, only that the noise no longer felt like protection, more like a wall he was leaning against. And somewhere beyond that wall, though he couldn't see it yet, someone was already waiting. Not long after, he began to see the radio differently, as if it had quietly changed shape when he wasn't looking. Its constant static no longer felt comforting, only restless, like a lake forever disturbed by invisible pebbles. He imagined the surface of that lake, how it might reflect the sky if only the ripples would stop. But the noise kept tossing small waves across it, breaking every image before it could settle. It struck him that he had been living inside that trembling reflection for years. One evening, he carried the radio to the kitchen table and set it down as though placing a burden he hadn't known he was carrying. The hiss filled the room, bouncing off the walls, leaving no corner untouched. He watched a glass of water beside it, noticing how even faint vibrations made the surface quiver. For a moment, he rested his palm against the table, feeling the subtle trembling beneath his skin. It was oddly similar to the tension he carried in his chest, constant and easy to ignore. He tried turning the dial slowly, searching for a clear station, but every frequency dissolved into the same shapeless sound. It reminded him of conversations where he nodded without hearing, of days that blurred into one another. How could he understand himself, he wondered, if everything inside him was always in motion? The thought lingered, uncomfortable, yet strangely precise, like a shoe that suddenly didn't fit. He left the dial between stations, unsure whether he was adjusting the radio or himself. Later, he opened the window, letting cool air slip into the room, and for a second the static seemed softer. He closed his eyes and pictured the lake again, this time imagining the ripples slowing, one by one. What would appear on that surface if it ever became still enough to reflect clearly? The question felt less frightening than before, though he couldn't say why. He noticed his breathing had slowed without his permission, as if something inside him were listening. When he finally reached toward the power switch, his fingers hovered just above it. The silence waiting on the other side felt tangible, like stepping onto unfamiliar ground. He wasn't ready to cross it yet, but he no longer turned away immediately either. Instead, he sat there with the soft static swirling around him, caught between habit and curiosity. And in that suspended moment, the room seemed to hold its breath along with him. A few days later, he wandered into a small repair shop tucked between a bakery and a shuttered bookstore. The sign above the door was faded, and for a moment he almost kept walking, unsure why he had stopped at all. Inside, clocks lined the walls, each ticking at its own unhurried pace, none trying to outdo the other. Behind the counter sat an older man polishing a pair of glasses, movements calm enough to make the air feel slower. The quiet there wasn't empty. It felt settled, like dust that had chosen where to rest. He placed the radio on the counter, apologizing for the noise as the static spilled into the gentle room. The man didn't flinch, didn't rush to fix it, only listened with a slight tilt of his head. Then, without a word, he reached forward and switched it off. The sudden silence didn't feel sharp the way it did at home. It landed softly, like snow. For a second, the man simply left his hand resting on the radio, as if acknowledging its long effort. "You hear more when it's quiet," he said at last, voice low and unhurried, like someone speaking to a skittish animal. No lecture followed, no explanation, just a gentle return to polishing the glasses. The clocks continued their patient ticking, filling the space without crowding it. He realized he wasn't reaching for his phone, wasn't searching for something to break the stillness. It was the first time silence had felt shared, rather than isolating. They sat like that for a while, the older man occasionally glancing up with a small, knowing smile. It wasn't the kind of smile that demanded anything. It simply made staying feel safe. He noticed his shoulders lowering, his jaw unclenching, as though his body had been waiting for permission. A memory surfaced, someone once telling him he didn't have to answer everything right away. He had dismissed it then, but here in the quiet, the idea felt unexpectedly kind. When he finally stood to leave, the man slid the radio back across the counter without turning it on. "Try carrying it like this for a while," he said, tapping the silent casing lightly. No instructions, no timeline, just an invitation folded into a simple gesture. Outside, the street noise rushed toward him again, but it no longer swallowed everything, and as he walked away, he became aware of a faint, unfamiliar sound, keeping pace with him, his own footsteps. Many of the stories you hear here aren't just stories. They reflect the invisible weight you may be carrying every day. If you're tired of holding pain, responsibility, and guilt that were never yours, I created an ebook called The Weight of Stones That Are Not Yours and More Too bonus for you. It's for those who want to let go, set boundaries, and live with more lightness. The link is in the description and in the pinned comment. He returned to the shop the next afternoon, radio tucked under his arm like something fragile. The older man greeted him with a nod, as if they had agreed on this meeting long ago without words. Again, the clocks ticked in their steady chorus, a quiet that felt alive rather than empty. He sat down this time without being asked, noticing how the chair didn't creak the way he expected. It was as though even the furniture understood the language of gentleness spoken there. After a while, the man placed a small hourglass on the counter and turned it over. "Just sit until the sand finishes," he said softly, then stepped away to the back room. At first, he watched the grains fall with restless attention, counting them without meaning to. Thoughts rose quickly. Things he'd said wrong, things left undone, faces he wished he had avoided. His hands twitched toward the silent radio, but he let them rest on his knees instead. Gradually, the urgency softened, like a storm remembering it had somewhere else to be. He noticed his breathing, uneven at first, then slower, deeper, as if settling into its natural rhythm. A strange realization surfaced. Nothing inside him needed to be chased away or solved immediately. The thoughts were only visitors, passing through a room he had mistaken for permanent residence. For the first time, he allowed them to arrive and leave without escort. When the man returned, he didn't ask what had happened, only turned the hourglass again. "Truth speaks quietly," he murmured, adjusting one of the clocks that had drifted a minute ahead. "It's already there. You don't build it. You uncover it." The words didn't feel heavy or mystical, just simple enough to be trusted. He found himself nodding, though he couldn't explain exactly what he understood. As he lifted the radio to leave, it felt lighter, though nothing had changed on the outside. He walked home without turning it on, noticing the rhythm of his steps, the whisper of wind past his ears. There were still questions waiting, still aches he hadn't named, but they no longer felt like enemies. Silence had shifted from a threat into something closer to a doorway, slightly open. And as he crossed his threshold, he hesitated, wondering what might be waiting if he stepped through. In the mornings, he began leaving the radio off for a minute before starting his day. At first, the quiet felt stiff, like wearing a new coat that hadn't learned his shape yet. He would stand by the window, watching light gather on the rooftops, breathing slowly just to steady himself. Some days he lasted only a few seconds before flicking the switch, half apologetic to the silence. But the next morning he tried again, as though returning to a place that might someday feel familiar. During a tense conversation at work, when a sharp comment landed harder than expected, he didn't react right away. Instead, he pressed his thumb lightly against his palm beneath the table, a small anchor no one could see. He imagined the hourglass, the sand falling one grain at a time, giving him permission to pause. The urge to defend himself softened, replaced by a quiet curiosity about why the words had stung. When he finally spoke, his voice surprised him by sounding calm, almost gentle. Evenings became different too, less about filling space and more about noticing it. He would sit on the edge of his bed, radio silent beside him, and let the day replay without judgment. Moments of embarrassment surfaced, along with small kindnesses he had overlooked at the time. Sometimes he wrote a single sentence in his notebook, nothing polished, just a truth he didn't want to lose. Closing the notebook felt like placing a stone down after carrying it longer than necessary. The discomfort didn't vanish overnight. Some nights the silence still pressed close, heavy and insistent. On those evenings, he placed a hand over his chest and counted 3 slow breaths, as if reassuring a restless animal. He noticed how the tension loosened slightly, enough to make staying possible. It wasn't dramatic, just a subtle easing, like a knot beginning to remember it could untie itself. He started trusting that calm could be practiced, not forced. Weeks passed, and insights began appearing in quiet, unannounced ways. He realized he missed certain people he had pushed away, that some ambitions weren't truly his own. The discoveries felt tender, like uncovering old photographs he hadn't known he kept. He didn't rush to act on them, only held them gently, letting their meaning unfold. And with each small moment of stillness, the person he had been avoiding grew a little less unfamiliar. One afternoon, he was called into a meeting that carried the faint smell of conflict before anyone spoke. A decision had to be made, quickly and publicly, the kind that usually pushed him into automatic agreement. Voices overlapped, opinions sharpened, and he felt the familiar pressure to choose the safest path. For a moment, his hand drifted toward his pocket where his phone waited like an escape hatch. Then he remembered the hourglass, the quiet shop, the way silence had once held him without judgment. He asked for a minute, surprising even himself, and stepped into the empty hallway. The building's hum faded behind the closed door, leaving a stillness that felt almost protective. He leaned against the cool wall, closed his eyes, and let one slow breath travel all the way down. Thoughts tried to crowd in, but he imagined them settling like dust in a beam of light. Beneath them, a quieter knowing waited, patient as ever. When he returned, the room seemed less overwhelming, the noise no longer pulling him in every direction. He listened instead of preparing his response, noticing what felt true rather than what sounded impressive. The choice he made wasn't dramatic, just honest, aligned with something steady inside him. A few people looked surprised. One even frowned, but the reaction didn't shake him the way it once would have. It felt like standing on solid ground after years of shifting sand. Later, walking home, he replayed the moment with a kind of gentle wonder. He hadn't needed the radio, hadn't reached for distraction, hadn't abandoned himself to keep the peace. The city noise swirled around him, yet it no longer drowned out the quieter rhythm beneath it. He realized that silence wasn't only found in empty rooms. It could travel with him, tucked just behind a breath. The discovery felt small enough to trust, yet powerful enough to change everything. That evening, he set the silent radio on the table and smiled at it, almost fondly. It no longer seemed like a shield, more like a reminder of how far he had wandered from himself. He touched the smooth surface, not to turn it on, but to acknowledge its long companionship. Outside, a breeze stirred the curtains, carrying the soft sounds of life continuing as usual. And for once, he didn't feel the need to fill the space between those sounds. A few mornings later, he noticed how naturally his day now began with a pocket of quiet. He would sit at the table, radio resting beside him like a retired guardian, hands wrapped around a warm cup. Instead of reaching for news or messages, he simply listened to the faint sounds already present. The hum of the refrigerator, a bird testing the air, his own breathing finding its pace. It felt less like doing something and more like allowing something to return. One day, he imagined someone else sitting across from him, equally tired, equally unsure where to begin. He pictured sliding the silent radio toward them, offering a small, reassuring nod. "Just a minute," he would say, as if sharing a secret too simple to sound convincing. No instructions beyond that, only the quiet companionship of someone who had once been afraid too. The thought warmed him, the way passing kindness often does long after the moment ends. He tried a small ritual, placing his palm lightly on the radio's surface and closing his eyes. As thoughts surfaced, a worry about money, a memory of embarrassment, a sharp voice from the past, he let them pass through without commentary. If one lingered, he pictured setting it gently on the table, like a stone no longer needed in his pocket. Sometimes he whispered a single sentence under his breath, something kind he wished he had heard sooner. It took less than a minute, yet it left a softness that stayed with him. During the day, whenever tension gathered, he would pause wherever he was, at a crosswalk, in a crowded line beside a ringing phone. One slow inhale, one steady exhale. Nothing elaborate, just a quiet return. He noticed how the world didn't collapse because he had stopped moving for a few seconds. If anything, it seemed to make room for him, as though recognizing a language it had always spoken. The practice felt almost invisible, which made it easier to keep. By evening, the silence no longer felt like something he had to create. It found him on its own. He would catch it between footsteps, in the pause before answering, in the space after laughter faded. Each time he greeted it like an old friend who had been waiting patiently at the edge of the room. The radio remained quiet, yet it no longer symbolized absence, only the choice to listen differently. And somewhere within that listening, a deeper recognition was beginning to take shape. Weeks later, he walked past the repair shop and noticed the clocks still keeping their quiet conversation with time. He didn't go in this time. He simply stood outside for a moment, listening to the hush between passing cars. The world hadn't grown quieter. He had learned how to meet it differently. Loneliness, he realized, had once been mistaken silence, like confusing an empty chair with an empty home. Now the quiet felt inhabited, gently alive, as if he had finally arrived where he'd been expected. At home, the radio remained on the table, untouched, no longer an enemy or a crutch. Sunlight gathered on its surface each afternoon, turning it into something almost ceremonial. He would pass by, sometimes brushing it with his fingertips, a small acknowledgement of what it had taught him. In the evenings, he sat by the window without needing to fill the room, watching the sky change its mind about color. There was peace in those ordinary transitions, a reassurance that nothing had to be forced. He noticed how decisions came easier now, guided by a steady sense rather than the loudest opinion nearby. When disappointment arrived, and it still did, he met it with the same quiet attention he had practiced. Criticism no longer echoed endlessly. It landed, rippled, and settled like a stone reaching the lakebed. He even laughed more, a soft, surprised laugh that didn't ask permission to exist. It felt like rediscovering a language he had known as a child and forgotten somewhere along the way. Sometimes he thought about the man in the shop, about the hourglass and the unhurried kindness. No grand lessons had been given, only space where he could hear what was already there. He understood now that silence wasn't the absence of life, but the place where life returned to itself. The realization didn't arrive like a revelation, more like dawn easing into the room without announcement, and he felt an unexpected gratitude for the long path that had led him back. One evening, as the first stars appeared, he carried the radio to the window and opened it wide. Cool air drifted in, lifting the curtains, carrying the distant murmur of people living their ordinary stories. He left the radio there, not discarded but released, a quiet symbol of a burden set down gently. Standing in the hush that followed, he sensed the same calm presence within his chest, steady and unmistakable. And as he watched the sky deepen, he realized he was no longer searching for a voice. He was listening from home.